Thanks for having me back. I think a year ago I spoke to you about this document, Renewing the Promise. It's a piece of work by the Bishops' Conference of Canada, and I have to say it's a wonderful piece of work, and we're going to focus on two parts of that today. My name is David Wells and I live here in England. I'm speaking to you from a small community in what we call the Peak District of England. It's a beautiful landscape in the heartlands of this country, and I'm here with Naomi and Tom, who are helping to make this happen. So thank you for listening, and here is a short presentation, the first of two in your day today, where we're going to take a little bit of a look, firstly at the section which you will find on page 8, that your school is a community that builds relationships. Now, why is that important? And why is it important for the bishops to say, look, it's not about me, it's about us? Well, what happens to us is very significant, I think, and it's not unusual to find yourself caught in this trap, that somehow we begin to believe, perhaps somehow in our upbringing, that if we have anything to offer, it's what we do on our own. It's our own invention, if you like. And to some extent, it's important to strive and work and push for those things. But there comes a time in which it can become a risk. Pope Francis says to us, he says, the great pragmatism of the daily life of the church, in which all is appearing to proceed normally, while in reality faith is wearing down and degenerating into small-mindedness. I think this is really interesting. For Pope Francis, he's not so worried about secularism. He's not worried about the world of culture. He's not so worried about Islam or other faiths. His concern is us becoming small-minded. That somehow, if I shrink into my own life, if my life becomes all about me, then I am not at the service of the world. I'm not at the service of the people around me, and I can't affect things. This is very dangerous in the life of any of us who work in a Catholic school, because it's so seductive, small-mindedness, us shrinking into ourselves. I don't know whether you remember or recall the Spice Girls. It might be me aging myself a bit here, but if you're old enough, take yourself back to the 1990s, folks. Mid-90s, the Everything is Spice Girls, at least in this country, and I believe in North America. What's interesting, if you read Jerry Halliwell's autobiography, there's quite a beautiful scene in there. It's November 1996, she's in a cradle high above Oxford Circus. She's with the other Spice Girls. They're about to turn on the Christmas tree lights. It's all going very well. And she says, I'm in this cradle. There are 10,000 people cheering my name for as far as the eye can see. And she says, at this moment, everything I'd hoped for, wanted, longed for, I was popular, they were chanting my name, I was a singer, I was rich, I was living the life. But at this moment, when I came to put those Christmas lights on, it dawned on me that I was empty, that somehow this couldn't satisfy, it won't work. My project had become me. That we can shrink into a kind of small-mindedness. Pope Francis describes it quite powerfully, in his preparations for the Youth Synod. He said, be really careful about the cult of your own success, that you don't make your life about you. Mother Teresa, Blessed Mother Teresa, said to us, your life isn't about you anyway. But at the start of things, be careful that you don't turn your life into some sort of comparison, that you don't turn one school in contest with another, one teacher in contest with another. Tell me this, do you know what you first boasted about? I mean, it's unlikely that you can remember, but people who teach really small children, those of you who work in kindergarten classes, they'll often tell me, first thing that most children compare is their age. They'll go up to each other and they'll say, "How old are you?" And the reply comes, "I'm 4. And then the reply comes to that, "Well, I'm 4 1/4. And there's already a contest there. It's not a bad thing, but it doesn't take long before that moves to possessions, you know. I've got the Galaxy S7, I've got Xbox, I've got whatever it is. And it doesn't take long to get from there to I'm popular, I've got a girlfriend, I've got a boyfriend, look at me. It's why teenagers kiss in front of everybody. It's like important. Excuse me, I'm lovable. You know, I only have to put my arm around my wife now and my kids look at me and go, that is disgusting. But here's the thing, you know, it doesn't take long to get from there to performance. How many A grades did you get? It doesn't take long to get from there to, well, how are you doing in your career? What are you earning? What's your authority? What's your status? Then one day we start boasting about our children and how well they're doing. Sally passed her oboe exam and everybody knows the oboe's harder than the clarinet. And then strangely, you know, you can wake up in a world one day in which you're even competing for illness. I mean, I remember when my mum had a heart attack, it nearly killed her. And they sewed her veins around her arteries to save her heart. And 2 or 3 days later, after this violent operation, she's walking along the corridor. She meets a guy coming in the other direction. And what is his question? They're both recovering from a tremendous operation. And he says to her, "Did you have a double or a triple bypass?" And my mum stared at him. She said, "A triple." And then he pointed at a man down the ward and said, "You see Harry in bed 7? Quadruple." You see, even our illness becomes a contest, and then strangely it can finish where it starts. And you'll meet people say, "I'm 94, you know." And you go, "Oh, that's lovely, well done." I once asked a group of parishioners, we ran an evening in a city in this country called Plymouth, and we had an evening in a parish hall. I know this sounds morbid, but we called it How to Prepare to Die, and it was packed. And there was quite a lot of fun, strangely, in this theme. But I said to them, "You don't mind, but I'm going to be speaking to quite a few teachers. Do you mind if I just ask you, when you get to your 70s and 80s, what do you boast about?" And one gentleman, he stood up at the back and he just waved his finger at me. And I said, "Yes, please." And he said, I didn't know what to say when he replied to this. He looked at me and he said, "All my friends are dead." I remember thinking, well done. But then a more uncomfortable thought came across my mind. That evening, I remember thinking, what a crazy contest. Who lived the longest? But I remember thinking later that evening, when somebody dies tragically, almost always the first question on everybody's lips is, how old were they? And where does that question come from? Do you know something? I can shrink my world into a contest, a cult of my own success. Something Pope Francis in his most recent exhortation warns us not to do. And we find in the Gospels that the disciples are arguing with each other over which of them is the best. For Pope Francis, the enemy of a community which builds relationships is not that we might have different ideas or beliefs, but that we might begin to look only inwards. How am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? Until one day, sadly, there's only me in my life. So how do we become distracted, in a good sense, away from the cult of my own small-mindedness? How do I stop myself? It's interesting that for Pope Francis, sometimes it's important to listen to what a person says often. I mean, it's nice to hear something you enjoy, right? But if I asked you about, say, your parents, and I said, what was their mantra? What was the thing they always said? You could probably think of a few things. Certainly, for those of you who are parents, if I asked your children, what are you always saying? They'd come up with some phrases. An interesting way of testing this is, have you ever noticed that sometimes your parents come out of your own mouth and you're going, oh my God, that's my dad speaking? Well, it's likely that whatever you were saying you heard often. It was drip fed into your upbringing. And it's the same when you're trying to measure a sense of a person. It's good to hear, what do they say often? When Pope Francis visited Lithuania last year, one of the things he implored the church there is to pour yourselves out and lose yourselves. It's a movement away from the ego. The ego isn't a bad thing. It pushes us, it helps us to achieve, it encourages us to believe we can make a difference. That's not a bad thing, but it self-serves. Eventually, we need to move out of ourselves to be poured out. It's a phrase that Pope Francis continually uses on pontifex, and you see him repeatedly in his homilies. This notion of try to lose yourself. In his very early days as the Holy Father, he was saying to the world that we need to put Christ at the centre, and that is disorientating. It means we somehow lessen. We don't become less significant. We don't become less precious. But our world depends a little bit less on us. It's actually worth praying about because we can be liberated. And I think that sometimes if our life becomes our own project, we can become worn down by it. I think I shared with you last year the wisdom of my dad on his deathbed. David, he said, don't take yourself too seriously. You're going to die. At first, it sounds like a rebuttal or a rebuff, but in fact, lived out, it's quite beautiful. You know, I can take myself too seriously, carry the weight of the world on my shoulders, and go to sleep anxiously. So, how does that manifest itself in a teaching career? Well, I don't like saying this to you particularly, but I'm going to. I remember, have you ever left a job that you really loved? I mean, it's one thing to leave when you're done. It's one thing to leave when circumstances push you away. But I came to leave a job that I absolutely loved. I was just restless. It was after 8 years of working in a school. I was young and they had every ounce of my flesh and blood. I tell you that for 8 years, more or less on a Sunday lunchtime, right through to a Friday evening, they had every waking moment of my day. And I loved it. I was no martyr. I loved the job. I worked hard. I stayed up till late working, and I could. I was fortunate. But when I came to leave that school, I'd been promoted and I'd enjoyed my time there. I remember thinking, forgive me. I remember thinking, they'll never replace me. Not really. Just because of how hard I worked. I look back now and I hate that thought. But I remember walking around the school, saying goodbye to it. The kids had gone home early, the young people had left, and we were having a bit of a party with the staff. It was an afternoon in July. I was wandering around the school, saying goodbye to the bricks and mortar, this place I'd poured out myself. And when I got back to my office, the caretaker, site manager, had unscrewed my name off my office door. I hadn't even left. I'd just gone for a walk around the building, but within the small scope, they'd taken my name down. It was quite salutary, really. I remember thinking, gosh, it doesn't take long to be wiped out. I handed my keys in, walked away from the school, and I have to admit, to this day, to my embarrassment, that school went on to do really well without me. It wasn't a bad lesson, but that's not the story. You know that's not the story. As I walked out of that school, sitting at the gate of the school where the school buses would normally arrive to pick up the young people, was Martin. Martin. He stood up awkwardly, 14 years old. One of those awkward young people, didn't quite know how to hold himself, to walk. A bit awkward around his peers, a little bit neglected, if I'm honest. Not always easy. And he stood up, and he stood to attention, and he was a boy that would quite often miss the bus home. And I said, Martin, you've missed your bus. Get in the car, I'll take you home. And he looked at me, and he said, no sir, I haven't missed the bus, sir. And then almost to attention, his arms rigid, he stood and he just said to me, sir, you was all right. It was his speech. He'd prepared it. It was the best he could do. But do you know something? He taught me something beautiful. You see, it turns out that they won't ever replace me. Oh, they'll replace what's on my office door. They'll replace the policies I wrote, the management schemes I introduced. They'll replace all that very quickly. But for him and I, you see, I'm irreplaceable. Not because I'm wonderful, but because the beauty of what we do, in fact, the best of what we do, is in the building of relationships. A community that builds relationships is a community centered on Christ, looking outwards. Sounds easy when you say those things. It takes a lifetime to actually properly work out what they mean. But we have a beautiful moment in Ephesians. That's a letter St. Paul writes to a community in Ephesus. And he prays, open the eyes of our hearts, Lord. Open the eyes of our hearts. It's a tough prayer. I'm not sure that I always want to open the eyes of my heart. It's where I will feel pity, good pity for the concern of others. It's where I'll feel mercy and compassion. But in order to do that, I will have to feel pain. In fact, the word compassion means to share pain. To open the eyes of our hearts is to begin to see the world in terms of relationships. And we're all a bit scared, you know, all of us, not just those of you sitting at the back, but those of you sitting at the front too, that somehow it makes us vulnerable. This is the Christian journey, to open the eyes of our hearts, to be distracted away from ourselves and into the needs of others. Unites the two commandments, the love of God with the love of neighbour. If you said to me, what's the difference between a Catholic school and other schools? It would be that we can name and understand that. It's not that we're better than anybody else. Kindness and love and compassion happens everywhere. But actually, in a Catholic school, it should be central and intentional. So here's the thing. I have to be wary that this is a lifetime journey and a challenge. I want to just give you one example, if I may. Many years ago, an elderly Franciscan friar came up to me. He was running a parish in the centre of a city called Nottingham, in the district called St Anne's, one of the most socially deprived areas of the city. And he came up to me and he said, "David, I need to build up the relationships with the school and with the home, because," he says, "I've got a parish church that's got lots of old people in it on a Sunday, and I've got a school next door that's got lots of young parents in it on a weekday, and I live in this huge district." He said, "But I can't get them together." He said, "Help me, can you, to reach out to the parents?" I said, "Father, I'd love to, but this is a struggle everywhere." He said, No, do whatever you must." Well, we sat down, we prayed, we thought, we worked, and it came to pass that just opposite the church was a pub, very important to the English, and here it goes. This pub was run by a Catholic, and the family in the pub said, "Look, we'll open one day a week after the parents have dropped their children off. We'll open the pub and we'll give them breakfast. Come in and talk to them." It sounded like a good plan, right? The parents arrived at the school, dropped their children off, and came to the pub opposite the church for a couple of hours, and I'd give a talk. And we planned this for 6 weeks on a Tuesday. It was a noble idea. I turned up a little bit more formally than this, in a suit. I had a large, what we called overhead projector in those days. For those of you that can remember, we worked with acetates. PowerPoint hadn't arrived yet. Plastic sheets with writing on. We shone onto a wall, and I began giving a talk. Now, have you ever given a lesson in which, in all honesty, you knew within minutes it wasn't working? Well, that was me. Within a few minutes of all these people arriving to the pub, a few things became obvious. Number one, they were all women. There wasn't a single man in the room. Number two, nearly all of them had lit cigarettes. Number three, they were talking to each other, and I had absolutely no presence whatsoever. My hands were sweating, my mouth drying. It's not working. And the only two people who are listening to me are two devotees just a few feet away from me, straining, staring at me the whole time. It was only later that I discovered that they were Polish and didn't understand a word I was saying. This was awful. And towards the end of the session, I put my sheets down, I put my equipment away, and I realised that, to be honest, these women had come for a free breakfast. Their children were in a creche next door, and this was an opportunity to meet. I went home and I said to my wife, "There must be something more we can do than we're doing." But somehow, whatever I was trying was useless. The next week I turned up and I plucked up the courage and I said, "Look, I hope you don't mind, but what shall we talk about? What would you like to talk about?" My talk on the Eucharist hadn't worked. And one of the women, I think possibly in an attempt to embarrass me, said from the back, "Let's talk about sex." And I have to tell you that for the next 5 weeks, every Tuesday morning, we talked about sex. Actually, it wasn't the sexual act so much as relationships. Most of these women had experiences with men that had been disappointing. Their lives tough, and men for them had been unreliable. And they began to talk, and they began to respond, and gradually I noticed that little by little over the coming weeks, the cigarettes were lit a bit later. The two women at the front had brought in an interpreter. It was beginning to work. It just wasn't what we'd intended. And then Father came week 4 and said to me, "David, shall I join you this morning?" And I remember thinking, oh dear, how do I explain to him that we've not got on to the sacraments? I know this is going to sound strange, but Week 6, I was almost more embarrassed about introducing my faith than I was about the material we'd discussed. However personal, somehow introducing the faith life of the community at this point seemed almost awkward. And at the end of the session, I looked at them and they looked at me and I said, look, before we finish today, it's our last time together. I'm going to light a candle. I'm going to read a piece of scripture and I'm going to pray for you. And you can go as soon as you're ready. But if anybody would like to stay, I'm going to pray for you for the rest of this morning. It took me by surprise that they all stayed. Every single one of them. The whole room. And when I lit the candle, I remember this woman, I'd said to them, if you want to pray out loud, you can. You don't need to find clever words. God knows what's in your heart. And if you don't want to pray out loud, just pray quietly. And this woman, she just said, Dear Lord, as though she were writing a letter. Dear Lord. And then she said, my life is hard. And then she began to weep. And as I looked up, they were all weeping, the whole room, full of women crying in this veil of tears. The prayer coming from the heart. I wish I'd learnt younger that if we want to make progress in life, in community, with each other, a certain vulnerability, a certain reality is required. And that's where we'll go next in this afternoon's talk. So here's a few questions to consider. Question number 1, when do I catch myself taking myself too seriously? You know, consumed by my own desire to control things, breathing the life out of the room with my own needless and over-exaggerated anxieties. Number 2, when am I distracted, perhaps even interrupted by the plight or the needs of others? And number 3, what small gestures can I make that would make a difference to others? Part 2. The second session explores another section of this document, Renewing the Promise. That one of the central themes of the document is that a Catholic community encourages engagement and instills hope. Ooh, there's quite a lot going on there, isn't there? So let's try and unpack that a little bit. A Catholic community encourages engagement and instills hope. Well, have you ever been into somebody's home and it's too tidy? I was talking to my wife about this. She said, don't denigrate tidiness, David. It's a way of showing respect. You know, and prepare the house for when you arrive as guests. That's a mark of respect. I said, no, I don't mean tidy. I mean too tidy. There's a difference. See? What is the difference? When tidiness becomes more important than the person, there's a danger or a risk that we miss what happens to us as people if everything is perfect, just in its right place. There's a sort of an obsession if we're not careful. It's interesting that Pope Francis is calling for a bruised, hurting and dirty church. Now, that's not a casual church. That's not a church where people don't care. So what's he getting at? Well, I went into somebody's home one evening. We were going out for dinner and we went to a couple's house. And when we got there, has this ever happened to you? You could tell with absolute certainty that there's been a row. It's hard to know exactly what the signs are, but before we'd sat down in the chair, we were both feeling, oh, this is going to be a long night. She was sitting opposite us on the other sofa. We were looking at each other, and he walked in, her husband, and she looked at him. All she did was move one eyebrow, just a couple of millimetres. It was only a couple of millimetres, just one eyebrow. And he left the room, and he came back a few minutes later in a different shirt. Imagine. All it takes is one eyebrow. I'm the youngest of three. My sister and my brother are older than me. We grew up in the same era, the same parents, the same gene pool, but I'm the only one who goes to church. Now, just to be clear, I don't think I'm better than them for that. I don't think I'm getting into heaven ahead of them, actually. In fact, the scriptures warn us not to think like that. David Wells, thieves and prostitutes are ahead of you in the line to the kingdom. And by the way, my brother and sister are not thieves and prostitutes. But it goes a little bit like this. We were chatting, and I said to her, Marion, she was going through a difficult time. And I remember saying, when I feel like I think you feel, I go to church. It's a bit tricky talking like that to your family. And she said, I can't go back there. And I said, why? And she said, you know why? And I said, I don't know why. And she said, they'll give me that look. And I said, what look? And she said, you know what look? That look that says, oh, you've come back, have you? And I looked at her for a minute and I thought, Marion, you stopped going to church 30 years ago. The people who looked at you like that are dead. It's funny, isn't it? If you tidy things too much, if you make things too subtle, too perfect, too clean and tidy, then in the end it's the smallest of gestures that put us off. Now there's a beautiful piece of Catholic theology, which is one of the reasons I'm a Catholic, and I love this. You come before God in a burning bush, and God says, take off your shoes. Reconnect with the dirt. No matter how holy this is going to get, you are not coming off the floor. I tell you something, I love this about Catholic theology, that it says, holiness will not take you away from mess, from dirt, from confusion, from irritation, from difficult people, from being difficult yourself. You're going to stay in the mess. There's nothing about holiness that's going to tidy up the world. Keep your feet in the dust. Jesus exemplifies that in John's Gospel, when to cure the blind man, he's going to spit into dust and rub the divine with the humane, heaven and earth, everything that we're about, in a handful of paste, rubbed onto somebody's eyes so they can see. What I love about this theology is it says, firstly, come out of yourself. And secondly, go into the world. This is no lofty, otherworldly experience we're on here, you know. A journey towards God will take you into the dust and the substance of every Monday morning. It's not going to take you away from the world. And that's beautiful in a way, because it takes our experience and it anoints everything. In the end, it's all connected. Creation, Monday, Friday, life, business, money, it's all part of the same thing. And we disconnect these things at our peril. We begin to see what Gerard Manley Hopkins said was, God in all things. Not just in the holy places, not just in the sanctuaries, but in the high street, in the nightclubs, in the places of work, in the morgues and in the hospitals, in all the places of our joy and suffering, there is the presence of God. Now this matters to us because when you begin to see it, you see it everywhere. And where you once thought it was confined, it explodes into our whole life experience. Let me tell you this little story from Canada. Do you mind? When we were a younger family, I had the privilege of going to Alberta. And I remember saying to my children, they'd never heard of Alberta, but I said, look, here is the place we're going. And I showed them a book with lots of pictures. And I said, look, sometimes Daddy's not going to be working. What would you like to do? We were very privileged to be even able to go. And the boys said, I want to do that. And I looked at it and it was a picture of a kayak on a lake in the mountains. And I said, well, we're going to a town called Jasper. I know just the place. And so it came to pass that after we'd been in Canada for a few days, I took the family, we went up into the mountains, we came across a place known famously there as the Pyramid Lake. It was dawn and the water was still. The wind hadn't risen. It was like glass. And as we cut our way into the lake on this kayak, we headed towards a place known as Pyramid Mountain. Granite, pink granite in the morning haze. A perfect triangle. The kind of mountain a child would draw. But because the water was so perfect, it formed a perfect diamond in the reflection. And we cut our way into this picture. And I said to the boys, look, isn't it beautiful? And my son Matthew looked at me and went, what? And I looked at him and he looked at me and I said, the view. And then he looked over my shoulder and then, what view? And I realised he couldn't see it. He couldn't see what I saw. He couldn't see perfection in the creation of God. He just saw a mountain. That's not the story. This is the story. As we were heading back to the place we'd hired the kayak, there was some commotion at the front of the boat and nervously I made my way to the front. The boat was wobbling and then I found Matthew. He'd been lying over the front of the boat with his hands in the water, and onto his hand had appeared the largest dragonfly I'd ever seen in my life. And Matthew just said, Dad, look. And a little bit of me wanted to go, what? But it was beautiful. And Matthew, pointing at the dragonfly, looked at me and he said, Dad, the colour on its back, it's the same as the colour in the water. And I realised that he could see something in the palm of his hand that I could see on the horizon. That once you begin to look with the eyes of faith, you can see beauty in almost everything. It's not always the same place, even as the people we love. But as our horizons broaden, our eyes open, we can move from what's in our hand to God's entire creation. And so beauty is everywhere, and so, writes the Catechism, is God. Once we begin to see God in all things, our relationship to it changes. A central tenet of Catholic social teaching, we find this in Pope Francis's document Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home, is that you won't exploit and you won't damage and you won't corrupt the things you care about and love. And in this context, Pope Francis broadens our whole horizon to creation itself. That essentially, creation is God's gift to us, we care for it, we become co-heirs, helping God to mercy the world. It's a theme that runs through Laudato Si, but maybe it's easier to put it like this. I remember as a young man wanting to buy a car. I found a car in the local newspaper. I drove to the house where the guy was selling it. It was a Ford, and I remember looking at it, and I rang my dad up. He was a man of few words, a very practical man. And I rang him up and I said, Dad, I'm looking at this Ford, it's 1986 model. It's quite nice. I think I'd like to buy it. And he began with a list of questions. Did you turn the engine? I did. I turned the engine. He said, did it run smoothly? I said, it did. He said, did you drive it? I said, I did. I drove it around the block. He said, well, he said, did you see where it was parked? I did. He said, was there any oil or water on the tarmac? I said, there wasn't. He said, how was the upholstery? I said, well, it was commensurate with the mileage, really. It doesn't look too worn out. And he continued with these questions, and then he interrupted himself. And he stopped and he asked a different question. He said, David, do you love the car? It was a strange question. And as though I was about to get engaged, I said, Dad, I do. And he just paused for a moment and then said, buy it. And I said, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why do you say that now? And he said, David, the car will break down. It will need help. But if you love the car, it won't feel expensive. And in that stupid small piece of advice, he taught me something very powerful. That things are not worth their monetary value, you know. It's a deception. The real issue is how much we value and love something. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis asks us, be compassionate and love creation. And in doing so, we love God and our neighbour. These things are intrinsically connected. Now, the American bishops go so far in 1998 as to say, if we don't do that, we damage the world and damage the church because we lose our credibility. A Christian is somebody engaged with the issues of the day, fighting for that which is worthy, fighting to cherish creation and to champion issues which prevent us from exploiting and damaging the very things we care about. This is our common home. Not to be too tidy, but to have our feet in the soil of reality, bringing the divine and the human together, championing the cause of justice so that the world itself is mercied. So, a Christian and a Christian community is somebody called to hold a big picture, a broad vision, a huge expanse. Have you ever watched people in an art gallery? Oh, do it sometime. Go and sit in one of those easy chairs in a sombre, silent art gallery and watch. Don't look at the paintings, they're part of it, but they're not all of it. Sometimes the best thing about an art gallery is the people, and watch them. It's very interesting. A lot of people will go into an art gallery and they'll go and look at a painting and they'll be only a foot away from it, and they will stare intently at the painting just for a brief moment, and then they'll look at the little plaque underneath the painting and they'll realise that it's a painting by a certain artist, and they'll read the title and then they'll walk away. Artists, you know, by and large, don't do that. People with an eye for beauty stand back. They stand back some distance from the painting. They're not too worried about who the painter is. They're not too worried about what the title of the painting is. What they do is they have an eye for beauty and then cherish it. Once you see beauty, you don't exploit it, you don't manipulate it, you cherish it. That's the vision of Pope Francis in Laudato Si. Cherish what you have and allow people to flourish in that cherishing. It's a big picture world. Now, we need two virtues to help us to achieve that. The first, I would suggest, is gratitude. Have you ever noticed in the Mass, the priest says in the preface, I think, to the Eucharistic prayer, Father, it is our duty and our salvation always and everywhere to give you thanks. Here's a little thing to practice. It's our duty and our very salvation to be grateful. Do you know something? Gratitude turns out to be the secret to a happy life. St. Therese of Lisieux did a great thing, She taught, to cheer up and to practice gratitude. Here's a little challenge maybe for this coming Lent. I know it's a long way off, but why not think about it in advance? Just for 5 minutes a day, for 40 days, count your blessings. Count the things that you have to be grateful for. Things that are not just pleasurable, but the very dirt beneath your feet. What is it that we are to be grateful for? This disposition of gratitude compels a more generous spirit in us. It cheers us up. It's quite interesting. And then that leads us to another virtue, the virtue of hope. A Catholic community instills a virtue of hope. What does that mean? It means that we look at creation and long for its recovery. We don't just look at things as they are and be satisfied. We hope for a better world. And for that reason, we're going to clear up plastic. We're going to stop destroying the ozone. We're going to think about our carbon trail. We're going to think about recycling, not because they're dutiful and noble things, but because we're co-heirs in creation. We're part of it. I love this about the virtue of hope. I think of the theologian Francois Péguy. He told a beautiful story based on the icon of Sophia, wisdom. And there she is, Sophia, with 3 daughters, and she names them Faith, Hope and Love. And he tells this story to help us understand hope. The 3 girls go on an adventure into the mountains. Who goes on the adventure first? Well, it's the daughter called Faith. She runs into her life. She runs into her life with enthusiasm. And who runs into the adventure second is Love, because Love remembers that we'll get hungry and takes a picnic. But who runs out into the adventure third? Hope. Because when nightfall comes and things aren't perfect and darkness descends and we're struggling with our lives, with our jobs, with all the things that we have to do, it's hope that brings us home. When you look at the world and you see injustice and pain and suffering and sorrow, exploitation and damage, our reaction is to be grateful for what we have and to hope for what is better. This is a Christian community instilling the virtue of hope. So, if I can be drawn away from my self-obsession, be led away from a world in which I am the centre, that I'm drawn into relationship with Christ and my neighbour, there is something quite beautiful about my chances of living a good life. And by that I don't just mean a noble life, I mean a happy life. As my horizons broaden, and as my world goes beyond my own concerns, I can be drawn into a better version of who I am. I'm going to need to practice certain virtues to achieve that, to be grateful, to be hopeful. But ultimately, in the end, my life, God willing, is not about me. Now here's the thing. I love this about Pope Francis's most recent exhortation, Christus Vivit. There he's encouraging us not just to make that journey out from ourselves and into the world, but also to engage with the issues of our day and champion justice. He says at times it's frustrating for him as the Holy Father. He says often I've waited as people have said once they have enough, they'll give what's left over to the poor. But it's quite interesting, he said on one occasion, that doesn't seem to happen. Once somebody's glass is filled, the glass seems to get bigger. It's as if we're never quite ready to start giving of ourselves. And I'm talking to myself when I say this. Perhaps the hardest challenge in the Christian life is to know when to stop taking and to start giving. Always imagining that if we just had a little bit more, we could do a bit more. I was taught this by a small boy. I remember going into a hospital when I was working on behalf of a charity here in England, and they were showing me around a hospital in a northern city called Jos, Nigeria. It's a war-torn city now, very impoverished, but at the time it was a peaceful place. And we went from ward to ward, looking at the work that the charity had done. When I came home, I was to be an ambassador. It all looked fine to me. I was enjoying the experience. It was tragic to see a hospital with so little equipment, with so little life-saving opportunity, and yet I met tremendous joy and conviction and beauty in that place. And when it came to lunchtime, I rather thought of myself that I'd done a good morning's work, greeting and supporting and encouraging. And they brought us our lunch. It was a small baguette, quite dry in its consistency and tired, but it was what they had and they shared it with us. And I remember taking this bread and saying thank you and saying, look, do you mind? I'm English and I love this heat. Do you mind if I just sit out the front of the hospital and just enjoy this? And they said, no, that's fine. So I left the party and found a seat in the entrance area of the hospital and was peeling back the bag that held the baguette. And just as I was about to take from it a bite of this bread, I saw just beyond the baguette the biggest pair of brown eyes you have ever seen staring up at me. And I looked at the eyes and I looked at the baguette, and then I thought, oh, I knew what I had to do, but I was hungry. And I broke the baguette in half. I made sure he had the slightly bigger half. He reached up tenderly, gently, and took the bread from my hand. He didn't snatch, but as soon as the bread was in his hand, he'd gone. He ran across the road and into a compound. And I remember thinking, sadly, really, to myself, it's a shame we didn't say anything. I peeled back the bag and began to eat my half of this dry loaf, the gift. And I was chewing, and then I noticed a commotion over the road as that little boy ran into a small football pitch and was surrounded by children, and he promptly sat down and began to break his bread into small pieces and give it away. And I remember thinking, behold the Lamb of God. There this little boy was teaching me something profound. It's interesting that perhaps for Jerry Halliwell, turning on the Christmas lights, hanging over the streets central London, and for me, sitting on that bench, this little boy had something to teach us about engaging with hope in the issues of his day and being fully fulfilled, happy in the experience that somehow I was witnessing a life well lived, someone who cherished not just their own concerns but the concerns of people around them. That boy had much to teach me, and I had to watch him carefully, for in that transaction was a greater cause, a noble life, a life lived to the full. So here are a few questions. Number one, where do I see beauty? And are there any unusual situations or circumstances where beauty surprises me? Number two, how is it possible for us to practice the virtues of gratitude and hope, to instill in one another those virtues? And question number 3. What are the issues of the day which require both a personal and a communal engagement? What are the issues of our times that need us to draw from our faith life some form of response, perhaps vocal, perhaps material, but a response more than just an inner thought? So to conclude, here are a few points which run like threads through Laudato Si, Pope Francis' document, Care for Our Common Home. Number 1, creation is a blessing. Learn to be thankful. Number 2, don't exploit what you're grateful for. Cherish it. Number 3, justice is about giving something its true value. Number 4, in caring for creation and preserving creation and cherishing creation, we become co-creators. We are merciful to creation. Number 5, we must all learn to live simply. And number 6, be humble. Be humble before creation.